Welcome, listeners. Have you ever stumbled upon something so extraordinary that it made you question everything you thought you knew about the familiar world around you? Today, we unravel a tale that begins on the sun-drenched fields of a struggling farm and takes a sharp turn into the unknown. What would you do if your quiet life was suddenly upended by a discovery that could change everything? Stay with us as we follow Farmer Jenkins on his journey, where mystery, greed, and determination collide in an unforgettable battle for what truly matters. Farmer Jenkins wiped the sweat from his brow as he strolled across his vast fields, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape. His farm used to be a lush, rich landscape, but now it was just withering away. It had been the same for years. He couldn't afford to do many renovations, but as he approached the neglected corner of his property, his jaw dropped in sheer disbelief. He usually didn't walk out this far on the farm. It was over a mile away. There, in the middle of nowhere, was a hole so immense that it seemed as though the earth had decided to swallow itself whole. How did that hole get there? The 70-year-old farmer walked around the edge of the massive hole in the ground, a colossal hole like the aftermath of a meteor strike. Its enormity suggested weeks of labor, yet not a single soul had bothered to inform him of this inexplicable excavation. How had he not heard the noise of this hole being dug? His curiosity heightened, and Farmer Jenkins ambled closer, an uneasy feeling gnawing in his stomach. He bent down to have a closer inspection at the risk of falling into the hole. The pit seemed to plunge into the very heart of the earth, leaving him bewildered and searching the horizon for answers. He had to know who or what was responsible for this gaping chasm on his land. He trudged closer, his worn boots sinking into the soft soil surrounding the crater. He had a gut feeling this wasn't some natural occurrence. It was man-made, deliberate. Panic tinged his voice as he fumbled for his phone, dialing up his neighbor, Farmer Brown. Days later, rumors reached his ears, whispered secrets that pointed to the neighboring Farmer Brown. He was on the bordering property of his farm. Perhaps he did see something. The intrigue deepened when Jenkins discovered that Brown had struck oil, an unimaginable fortune lying beneath the surface of the earth. Farmer Jenkins wanted to call him out on it. His neighbor took some time to answer. "Brown, you won't believe what's on my land. It's a hole, a gigantic hole. Did you have anything to do with this?" Jenkins blurted out, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. "Jenkins, old buddy, I found something big. I found oil on my land. I had to dig deep to get it," Brown admitted. Jenkins felt a surge of emotions, shock, anger, and a tinge of jealousy. He had always considered his land the most fertile, the most promising. "Oil, you say? What about my land? You think you can just dig wherever you please without asking?" Brown hesitated. "Look, Jenkins, I didn't think it'd be a big deal. I'll make it right, all right? I'll pay for any damages, I promise. I'll even compensate you for the oil." Jenkins, realizing the value of what lay beneath, pressed Brown for the true worth of the black gold. Days later, Jenkins received a letter from Brown's lawyer outlining the compensation offer. The damages were mentioned, but there was a quiet whisper of intent to acquire the land. Anger bubbled within Jenkins. He wouldn't let Brown take advantage of this situation. He was prepared to fight back to keep what was rightfully his. Anger and betrayal gripped Jenkins as he grappled with the realization that his land held treasures beyond his wildest dreams and someone else had claimed them. He wasn't much of a businessman, but he needed to learn some basics if he was going to fight them in court. Brown, growing frustrated, decided to escalate matters. He hired a slick lawyer, a man with a reputation for bending the truth. A week passed, and Jenkins, fueled by stubbornness, refused the offer. He believed his land held more value than the money Brown was willing to throw his way. Farmer Jenkins and his wife Martha were worried as the court date loomed near. They always kept to themselves and hated being the center of attention. How would they deal with all the attention? They both got all their paperwork, the deed to the land, and more evidence to support their case. They wanted Brown off their property, And that was that. In a dimly lit courtroom, tension hung heavy in the air. Jenkins, a man of the soil, felt out of place among the polished legal minds. The lawyer, a silver-tongued charmer, tried to convince the jury that Jenkins's land was practically begging to be sold. The standpoint was that Farmer Brown discovered the oil first, so he should have first claim to its use. Jenkins knew that he could fight off anything that Brown and his lawyer threw at him, but the poor farmer had no idea what trick the man had up his sleeve. In desperation, Brown revealed that he was merely being puppeteered by a much more sinister figure. Jenkins stood ever vigilant against his aggressors. He made it clear that he wouldn't budge for anything, and no matter what the crafty lawyer tried, he wouldn't budge. But unfortunately, there was a lot out of Jenkins' control. He could see the frustration on Brown's face, but then he glanced down at his phone and went pale. He kept looking at the back of the courtroom. What did he see? Clearly, something was wrong. His competitor was worried about something, and it wasn't him. There was a third party interested in the land, but they had stayed in the dark until now. Then there was the sound of the doors behind the men opening. Jenkins looked behind him and saw men in suits entering the courtroom. The man at the front of the group flashed a wolfish grin at Jenkins as he strolled to the front of the court. "Who are you?" the judge asked, seemingly taken aback by the rudeness. "Mr. Brown is merely one of our representatives. He contacted us when he first found the oil. I think you'll find that we have more than the right to take it off Mr. Jenkins's hands." Many people in the court gasped in disbelief as the suited man approached Mr. Brown and sat beside him. Jenkins studied Mr. Brown's face, noticing that he was trying to hide fear. One of them consulted Brown's lawyer. Even the lawyer seemed a little scared of who the men were. By the end of the conversation, it seemed that the lawyer had a new strategy. "I would like to introduce the courtroom to the company that I am working with," Brown said nervously. The men ended up being a hungry oil company that wanted to grab Jenkins' oil to refine and sell themselves. "Mr. Jenkins, you don't have the means to refine the oil yourself," the lawyer said. "My client would end up doing that anyway. You'd make more money selling your property than selling unrefined oil." What the lawyer said was true, but it was his land. It had been in his family for generations. The lawyer tried desperately to convince and beguile the old farmer. He tried making convincing arguments about the value of his land versus the oil, but everything he had said up to that point fell on deaf ears. But when his nice guy attitude didn't work, he decided to switch strategy. He was about to get nasty. The lawyer started claiming that the oil company had rights to the oil deposit that Brown had found. Oil counts towards mineral rights, while Mr. Jenkins merely had surface and property rights to his land, the lawyer said. The lawyer representing Jenkins didn't seem too happy when the rival lawyer brought up mineral rights. Surely they were making it up. The Jenkins family had owned the farm for generations, but how could anyone else own anything on it? Jenkins held his head in his hands. He had a headache from stress. The courtroom fell silent as the same question was on everyone's mind. Was it true? Did they have rights to the oil? And if they did, would that mean he would have to sell his property? Jenkins thought about greedy corporations. This wasn't the first time someone had been forced out of their home for profit. It was now the turn of Jenkins' lawyer to try to refute the claim on his land. He seemed nervous and jumpy as he rifled through his notes. Jenkins watched his lawyer closely as he stood up at the stand and got ready to make his case. He would be lying if he said he had a lot of faith. Jenkins thought back to how he had even gotten the lawyer in the first place. His name was Jonathan Myers, and he had offered to help him pro bono. Jenkins was unfamiliar with the law and decided to do a bit of research to find the best lawyer that he could afford. After searching for a few weeks, he put on his best suit and headed into the city. He walked into a big corporate building where he took the elevator to the top floor. Jenkins walked into the office and saw an important-looking man sitting behind a chair. He shook his hand, and the farmer could immediately sense the weight of his charisma. Jenkins knew that this was a man who could win the case, but he was expensive. The farmer simply couldn't afford him. After hearing Jenkins' predicament, the lawyer said that he could do it with no problem. But when it came time for his fees, Jenkins' eyes grew large at the absurd price he wanted. Jenkins told him that he'd have to find someone else and apologize for wasting his time. But that's when the lawyer stopped him in his tracks. Jenkins snapped back to the present and stared at the charming lawyer. Mr. Myers had been all too eager to help out the farmer when he heard about his plight, so he had offered to do the case with no charge. Jenkins naively assumed that it was because he wanted to see that justice was served, but he was wrong. He watched the lawyer give a smirk. Had he set the farmer up? Perhaps the company was paying him to do this. Jenkins couldn't believe he had trusted the lawyer just for him to stab him in the back. But he was watching and waiting to see if his theory would prove true. Mr. Myers told the courtroom that his opposition had made a convincing case. He stated that the company had done their research and normally they would have the case in the bag. Jenkins watched him put on his moves, but he had no idea who he was doing them for. Was he going to stab him in the back or save his farm from tyranny? The lawyer stated that there was truth to what Mr. Brown's lawyer had said. There was indeed a distinction between land rights and mineral rights. Finally, the lawyer was showing his true colors. Jenkins felt validated in that his theory was correct. Jenkins knew that he had to try and do something to stop the lawyer from ruining him. He had lost all hope that he would see a single cent of the money the company would get from his oil, but more importantly, he lost his livelihood in the process. The farmer was dismayed as he thought about all of the farmers before him who lived on the farm. He'd failed his family. The farmer, in a desperate attempt to do something, did something that no one expected. He stood up in the courtroom against protocol, insisting on a private word with the lawyer. Though the judge was initially displeased, the lawyer managed to get permission. In a tense, whispered exchange, Jenkins accused the lawyer of betraying him, saying his defense sounded more like an attack. The lawyer, looking puzzled, tried to assure Jenkins that he was working on a plan to help him win, but Jenkins remained wary and determined not to be taken down without a fight. The lawyer seemed to be getting annoyed too. Was it because he was finally found out? The lawyer sighed and explained to Jenkins that it was all part of his plan. He promised the farmer that he was going to get his land back for him, no matter what. The farmer didn't understand delicate tactics like the lawyer did. He reluctantly agreed to let him keep going. With their congregation finished, the lawyer stepped back up and apologized to the judge. Jenkins sat back and watched. His farm was now in the hands of the lawyer. He just hoped that he made it count. But I don't believe that the rights belong to the corporation. Neither of them. Mr. Jenkins has rights to both, the lawyer said. The courtroom fell silent at the revelation. But now came the hard part. Jenkins wondered if he was bluffing in a desperate bid to win, or if there was truth to everything he had said. The lawyer continued to explain that the only way that Mr. Jenkins wouldn't have surface rights was if he had ever struck a deal with any companies before. Brown's face dropped at the explanation. The courtroom was silent again. But would the prosecution have any counter-arguments? With Jenkins' lawyer's last statement, the opposing side's lawyer shot up again and took the stand. But he didn't seem to have anything to say. He had hoped that Jenkins would crack under the pressure. For now, they were defeated. But that was only the first day in court. It was still going to be a long court case. Days turned to weeks, and the courtroom became the stage for a battle of wills. The lawyer, a silver-tongued advocate, attempted to coerce Jenkins into selling his land. The offer was substantial, but Jenkins, fueled by a mix of pride and stubbornness, stood firm. "That is my property, and I demand that you stop using it immediately," Jenkins responded with gusto. Jenkins surprised everyone in the courtroom with his fierce determination, declaring that Brown would pay for every inch of damage to his land, while Brown's lawyer tried to sway the jury by emphasizing the wealth beneath Jenkins' property. Calling it a gold mine, Jenkins remained unmoved. He refused to sell, standing firm in his conviction that the land, in his family for generations, was priceless and not for sale. His unwavering stance impressed even the judge, who took notes, leaving the courtroom to wonder if the verdict would go in Jenkins' favor. The room was dismissed for a short recess as they tried to get their minds in order. They realized that it was time to hear the verdict. The court was filled again. Everyone took their seats. The farmers all waited for the jury to re-enter. Mrs. Jenkins couldn't stop crying, and she was upsetting everyone. But they sat down and waited for the judge to be seated. Soon they would know what the outcome would be. Jenkins anxiously awaited the jury's decision, fearing he might lose his land. When the foreman finally declared the verdict in his favor, Jenkins felt an overwhelming relief while his wife cried tears of joy. Despite his courtroom victory, Jenkins knew his adversary Brown would not give up easily. As Brown plotted new schemes, Jenkins resolved to take control of his land and resources. Frustrated with ongoing legal battles, Jenkins took decisive action, opening the oil well himself. The oil surged forth, transforming his fortunes and ensuring his independence. Word of Jenkins' triumph spread, leaving Brown defeated and the town in awe. Standing proudly on his land, Jenkins felt a deep satisfaction, knowing he had preserved his family's legacy and won against greed.